Good morning, everyone. According to my clock, it's time to get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining our special session talking about trade, tariffs, and other issues that's facing our economy. We invited Dr. Larry Sanders to discuss all the issues with us, and you'll find that I believe you'll find very interesting and informing. Other than that, our next session will be around the 1st of May. I'll have to be letting you know exactly what will be coming on that session, but right now, one of the presenters, I guess, is taking a vacation, so unable to present, so we'll see what happens. Anyway, also, watching the text chat, so if you have questions, concerns, comments, please type those in, and I'll let Larry know and pass those on. Other than that, Larry, if you want to get started, we'll get cranking here. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. It's always an honor to talk to you folks that are out in the trenches. It's a beautiful day in Oklahoma. I want to start with maybe 3 caveats, if you'll permit me. First of all, the ground is shifting under our feet as we move. I stayed up late last night and thought I had the most current information and shipped this off to JC sometime between 10:30 and 11:30 last night and Sunday night, and woke up this morning at 5 o'clock to find that in fact the Chinese have formalized their retaliation and were off and running on the beginning of a trade war, which we'll discuss here momentarily. And we have a list of the tariffs they're imposing on American products that we try to sell to China. Secondly, I just am recovering from a nasal surgery, and it's affected my voice projection. I think my voice is stronger, but halfway through it may start to fade, and I'll rely on my technicians here to adjust as necessary, or you adjust your volume. Last caveat is that some of this presentation is very basic. It may bore some of you to tears, but I keep getting asked to make this very basic so that some of you have tools that you can use to go out to a variety of audiences, from youth to various groups in the community who are not familiar perhaps with these kinds of activities. So I've tried to make it pretty basic in some places. So let's talk about tariffs generically. These are nothing more than government imposed taxes on selected imported goods. You can think of them as border taxes on what we are trying to buy from the rest of the world. Imported goods are what we buy from other countries. So when we talk about imported goods, that's what we're talking about. The reason behind tariffs are fairly basic. They're usually intended to protect domestic markets for a variety of reasons. Could be infant interest industries, could be for national security, could be for other specific reasons. So if we talk about a tax-free, tariff-free exchange, you know, it's pretty basic. The consumer goes into the global market with a bag of money, and they're intent on buying something, for example, rolled steel or rolled aluminum to process in the domestic economy. And then exchange is made with the consumer paying money to that foreign country that's offering it, and in return those companies in foreign countries ship that off and exchange it to us for that money. So that's the very basic activity that happens in a free market kind of situation. We've seen that get a little more complicated in the last couple of months because the Trump administration has begun to impose protective tariffs for a variety of reasons. And so U.S. consumers have to go to the global market with extra money to get that product from foreign countries. And they'll still pay the basic cost to that country for that product, but they're also going to pay a lost my pointer here. They're also going to pay a tax or that tariff to Uncle Sam. So the cost has gone up by the size of that tariff or tax. And there are some cases where the tariff or tax is paid in a different way, but this is the most basic way. And then what happens is those dollars are used by the federal government for a variety of purposes, and the foreign company sends that good or service to the United States to the customers here that are buying it. I say that those tariffs or taxes are used for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they just go into general revenue, and so it increases the revenue that Uncle Sam is receiving from the marketplace. Sometimes it's used to help those protected industries, maybe help them improve their technology, maybe help them provide better salaries to their workers, a variety of reasons. And we don't know yet what is going to happen with the specific tariffs that we're talking about. So here's what seems to be happening as of this morning. U.S. customers are still going out into the market trying to buy from foreign countries. We'll say China as an example, and give them money for those. And we have this tax or tariff that Uncle Sam is charging. So U.S. customers have to pay an additional amount in the form of that tariff or tax to Uncle Sam. And in return, those foreign companies, just like before, are providing that good to U.S. Customers. But what's happening as we wake up this morning is that China, for example, has decided that they're mad as heck and they're not going to take it anymore. And they've decided to retaliate with their own set of tariffs or taxes. And so U.S. farmers, as an example, that want to continue to sell product to China are waking up finding that not only are they going to get money from the customers in China, but those Chinese customers are going to have to pay an additional tariff or tax to the Chinese government, and we're still going to sell whatever product they're willing to buy from us. But in effect, it's made our agricultural products more expensive to China. And we'll talk specifically about what markets the Chinese have decided to target here momentarily. Let's just kind of step back and take a look at history, because we can learn from history, whether some of us want to admit it or not. And let's go back about 100 years. That may be back farther than we need to, but there's a good story to be told. About 100 years ago, it was the Democrats that were pro-trade and the Republicans that were anti-trade, or at least pro-tariffs. They hoped that they could see higher farm prices and more government revenue if they imposed tariffs in the marketplace on what we bought from the rest of the world. And so in 1928, Hoover campaigned to raise tariffs on farm commodities It was one of the reasons he was elected, because farmers were suffering from really low prices at the time. And so he said, I'm going to protect domestic farmers, and this is going to keep domestic prices higher than world prices. And we're going to be able to have effectively price supports without production controls. And this was formalized in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Some of you may recall this in your classes. But it spread these tariffs out not only on the ag sector, but across the industrial spectrum. So where the average rate of tariffs on imports was about 15% in the 1920s, in the early 1930s, it was 50% or higher. The results were draconian. Exports of United States sales to the rest of the world dropped from over $5 billion in 1929 to less than $2 billion in 1933. Wheat, cotton, tobacco, and lumber were hit the hardest. We hope we're not going to see a repeat of that this time around. It's probably not as severe, but it's a story that has some messages for us to ponder here 100 years later. Those other countries, of course, retaliated. That's why we saw the hit. And we were already in a depression, so this Tariff Act didn't cause the depression, but it made it worse and it made it longer. President Roosevelt came into office, and he helped push through the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, which cut tariffs with other countries in bilateral trade agreements. So we came to the table with those countries and said, okay, we'll back off our tariffs if you'll back off yours. And we had a variety of these bilateral trade agreements that in short order reduced the negative impacts of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. So if we take a big picture look at history, I'm not going to go back to the 1800s, although that's what this chart shows, but this shows the value of global exports. And look at what really happened mid-century, mid-20th century. What happened was we started a global agreement called the Global General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was a post-World War II agreement with the Allies initially, and this really began to take off in 1950. In the 1970s and 80s, certain rounds of GATT tried to begin to target agricultural goods and services trades tariffs. And then later in the 80s and 90s, again, they targeted agricultural products specifically. And you can see that the payoff was that global exports just took off exponentially. And we could talk for a week about these various agreements. I'm not going to do that here, but just to look maybe again a little bit more specifically, the dark blue black line shows our agricultural exports to the rest of the world. And again, they really took off in the 70s. And we were in record-breaking territory for the last 8 years or so. It's tapered off some, even though we're still much higher than we were in the 90s and early 2000s. The orange or yellow line shows what we bought from the rest of the world in agricultural products, and likewise, that's been in record-breaking territory since we've engaged in GATT and the follow-up World Trade Organization. And again, the primary emphasis of those trade agreements, both the big ones and the bilateral trade agreements that we've had since then, have been to reduce tariffs. So we have been a leader at the table of these world and bilateral trade agreements in convincing the world that it was a win-win situation to cut tariffs on both sides. And as you can see, it's paid off. So you want to know perhaps what kinds of agricultural products benefit from trade. Just look at this slide up in the top left-hand corner. We don't have to talk about details, but soybeans are probably the primary benefactor of exports. About 80% of soybeans, about 40 to 50% of soybeans are exported to the rest of the world. Cotton is by far and away our largest benefactor, and you see that we've been up in that 80% range of cotton sold to the rest of the world. That's really increased our cotton market and buoyed our cotton prices. Wheat, we know, is a big commodity here in Oklahoma, and we won't look at the bars specifically, but just look at that gold line that runs through the gold bars, and you can see that 10 to 15% of wheat that we produce is exported to the rest of the world. So it's not insignificant. It's nowhere near as major as cotton and soybeans, but it does contribute to driving up prices of wheat here in this country because it expands our markets. Meat is also part of this story. It's not as large as our crop products are, but you can see that poultry leads the pack, followed by pork in the blue range and beef in the red range. And somewhere around 2025 to 2030, will probably exceed 20 to 25 billion pounds of meat exported to the rest of the world if we continue along these current trend lines. There's going to be some hiccups in this, especially with the trade war that's beginning to occur right now, but we hope that's just going to be a short-term impact. So we've talked about tariffs and what they mean. We've talked a bit about what agricultural products from the United States are benefiting from a freer market, not a completely free market, but reduced tariffs, and what are likely to be at risk if we have trade wars. Let's look at trade agreements in general. It's pretty clear by now, I hope, that you can see that U.S. agriculture has over a 50-year history of benefiting from trade agreements and reducing tariffs. Tariffs generally do more harm than good. The Trump tariffs are likely to hurt U.S. consumers because they're going to pay more for what they buy from other countries in the world. And it's going to hurt farmers who are trying to sell to other countries who decide to retaliate. Tariffs might produce short-term gains for targeted sectors, but in the long term, it's a lose-lose proposition. And scientific analysis generally bears this out. So to unmuddy the waters a bit and to make sure that we understand what's been happening over the past 2 months, there are actually two sets of tariffs that the Trump administration has announced and decided to impose. The first one is a broad set of tariffs on specifically steel and aluminum. And their reason or excuse is to protect national security, that they're worried about us losing the steel and aluminum industries in the United States. And if we lose those, it will impact negatively on our national security. But almost as soon as Trump announced these, his negotiators began to negotiate with the countries that would be impacted. And very quickly, they exempted Canada, which is our #1 source of steel and aluminum that we import from other countries, and Mexico, which is our #4 source of steel. And we've begun to see that list of countries expand, probably with EU countries and probably with South Korea. We may not have seen the final negotiations with those yet. But China has not been exempted for that, and we do get some steel and aluminum from them. So that was the first thing to upset China. And just as a reminder, I'll keep hitting it again and again, tariffs are really nothing more than a tax on what we buy from other countries, or if other countries impose tariffs, it's a tariff on what they sell to the rest of the world. And tariffs make these goods and services more expensive in the marketplace. So if a country has an opportunity, if a consumer has an opportunity to buy from somewhere else, it's going to go somewhere else to buy instead of buying from the country that's imposed the tariffs. And it's directly an intention to protect U.S. industries and their workers. Now, the other set of tariffs, not to be confused with the first set, is specifically on China because they have clearly been stealing or abusing our intellectual property rights, either the government in general or Chinese private companies. So the Trump administration announced $50 billion in Chinese import tariffs, specifically on consumer electronics that we buy from China, on tires and rubber that we get from China, on automotive parts that we get from China, and on machinery, primarily tools, etc., that we get from China. So if you're a consumer of those things, they are going to be more expensive in the marketplace now. And there's going to be less pressure for domestic producers to lower their prices and be more competitive. If you are an indirect consumer, say you are a consumer of automobiles, automobiles are going to be more expensive, or their prices are going to be less competitive if they're made in the United States because of this import tariff we've imposed on Chinese goods and services. Now, last night I was ready to talk about the potential of a trade war with China in that they could retaliate. We woke up this morning to hear, in fact, they have decided to formally retaliate. So we have begun the first stages of a trade war with China. And they have said that they are going to impose tariffs of 15 to 25% on $3 billion in U.S. food and agricultural exports from the United States. Now, $3 billion is not, in the scheme of things, a big deal. We sell about 26 trillion with a T dollars of agricultural stuff to China. So 3 billion is relatively small, but for those individual sectors and for those individual producers, this could have a serious impact, and trade wars tend to get worse before they get better. So let me just read, if I can, what just came off the web on the goods. China has announced that they are imposing retaliatory tariffs on 128 U.S. exports to China. These classes, 128 classes of goods and services. Now, these include things that might impact Oklahoma, other fresh and dried nuts, fresh watermelon and fresh cantaloupe. Now, we really don't export much of that to China, but because other states do, and they're going to be forced to sell more of those domestically, it's probably going to drive down prices of watermelon and cantaloupe here in the United States because of that. So that may occur to producers here in Oklahoma. Ethanol gets a 15% tariff from China. And again, we don't have ethanol plants in Oklahoma, but we have some grains that go into the marketplace to help ethanol, and that's going to have an impact on them. Pork, most of the pig, if not all of it, has been slapped with a 25% tariff. Now, we do export a lot of pork to the rest of the world. Whether many of our pork products get exported to China directly, this is going to have an adverse impact on pork in Oklahoma. So that's something that we're going to have to be watching. So where I was going to talk last night about the potential, it is real now that China has imposed these tariffs. Now, just so you're aware, just look at the list over on the right of the kind of things we sell, the top 10 or 12 products that the United States sells in agricultural products to China. About $15 billion in soybeans. They have chosen not to impose tariffs at this time. About $3 billion in forest products, about $1 billion in fish products. You look down at wheat, it's about $370 million. Pork, $670 million. Cotton, almost $1 billion. So, if China decides to expand its retaliation in this trade war, we're going to begin to see more of those kinds of products targeted with tariffs, and then that will potentially have an adverse impact on more producers in Oklahoma. So, just as a thumbnail scan of the scene in Oklahoma, we export about 50% of our agricultural goods and services to countries that are on that steel producing list. That's a bit more than what the United States exports in agricultural goods and services. So we're at risk if Trump doesn't give more exemptions to more of those countries. We export about 20% of our agricultural products to aluminum producing countries, and that's not quite as much as what the U.S. ag export market is. And as I said, soybeans are at risk. Pork is now on the list. Chicken and chicken parts are potentially on the list, although that's not significant. Domestically, canned goods are typically, the steel is typically rolled by imported steel, and beverages that we drink, those cans are typically rolled from imported aluminum. While that's not a significant cost in canned foods and beverages, there's the potential for those costs to go up or not go down when the market might otherwise encourage it to. This graph could get messy in a hurry. So I'm not going to dwell on it a lot, but I just wanted to go back in history because some of you asked about this. And um, what the chart shows, the line chart, that blue chart that bounces up and down, is our annual growth rate in the economy, our U.S. GDP. And we see that over the past 50 to 60 years, there has been some tariffs imposed. So that top line of 1.6% in 64 and 5 to 1% in 2018 are the size of tariffs on average that the U.S. imposes. And the line across the bottom of the table shows the range of change in annual growth rate. There was a short-term gain in 65 from, in part due to the tariffs, a little bit, very marginal gain in 1980 and 81, somewhat significant gain in 2009 and 10, and a marginal gain in 2012, 2013, when Obama imposed the tariffs on tires. Didn't last very long. Saw that it wasn't really helping. It was hurting more than it was helping. And so now we're at a growth rate of 3, maybe 4%. We ended 2017 with a 4% gain, and we have to let the story unfold as to what kind of impact these increases in tariffs are going to be that Trump has just imposed, and the retaliations that result therefrom. Again, I talked about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, 50%. The reason I want to talk a little bit more about history, in 1962, the Kennedy-Johnson era, we passed the Trade Expansion Act, and basically it was a threat to the rest of the world that we were going to impose 80% tariffs across the board. And the threat was because we weren't getting anywhere in current GATT trade talks. And so it was kind of a bluff that was backed up with real action by Congress. And as a result, the member nations of GATT at the table said, okay, we will begin to be more serious about lowering our country tariffs as long as you don't impose these. So we never really imposed those 80% tariffs, but the threat of them hanging over other countries did lead to some breakthroughs at the GATT talks. 2011, 2012, as I said, Obama imposed tariffs on Chinese tires, very, very short run gains. Very quickly, the losses were greater than the gains, so we stopped that. And then in 2017 and 2018, Trump has used this Trade Expansion Act of 1962, specifically using the excuse of concerns about our national security, to announce tariffs on steel and aluminum, and more recently on intellectual property right theft and abuse. So, you can look over here to the right again and look at how much tariffs had dropped off in the United States over this period of time, and how this has affected imports for our country and the rest of the world. So here we sit. We've had Trump announce these tariffs, and we're beginning to have the early stages of a trade war with China, at least. The short-term winners in the United States are domestic steel and aluminum companies, domestic steel and aluminum company related workers, the in-marketing chain and the on-marketing chains related to those domestic producers, unless they rely on imported steel and aluminum. And we're going to see the coffers of the federal government have more revenue pouring into it. Losers in this period are going to be U.S. consumers. We're going to be paying more for a variety of products. Import-related American workers are going to be suffering. Those that work the docks, those that work on shipping, and those that work on the distribution chain that moves the imported product out into the United States. Processing companies who rely on imported steel and aluminum, such as some of the automobile companies in the United States, beverage companies that use rolled aluminum for the cans, appliances, etc., and other Chinese imports. Importing countries, farmers are, it appears, going to begin to be losers in this in the early stages of it because of the retaliation of China. And again, on the margin, it's not going to be a big deal, but if it goes for a longer period of time, and if it gets more serious, those losses to consumers and farmers in the United States are only going to increase. So as we move into this trade war stage, short run, targeted sectors and their labor forces are winners. Losers are those targeted by China, the EU, South Korea, the loss of markets. What is already beginning to happen that we won't see for a period of time is that because purchasers of U.S. farm products that are now facing additional tariffs on the cost, those consumers in China are already going out and costing product in other countries. So if they can get pork from another country cheaper than what they can now get it from the United States because of those tariffs, they're going to switch their markets if they're happy with that product. If there's quality issues, that may slow it down. Value of the dollar may slow it down, but they're already beginning to do this. So kind of buried in the future is the potential for semi-permanent loss of markets, because our folks really have to work hard to get those markets and maintain them and keep them strong. And when prices go up, de facto prices because of tariffs, it's hard for them to continue to maintain and compete with those. So the trade deficit is going to worsen, at least in the short run. And we've already seen it worsening under the Trump administration. So just to kind of begin to sum this up, the protected industries gain in the short run. There are losses likely in the rest of the economy of the United States. There'll be some additional revenue from the tariffs into the federal coffers, and there'll be more severe losses as we move into retaliation, especially in targeted industries like agriculture that we saw this morning. Smoot-Hawley Act has a story to tell that is not to be ignored. I don't think we'll ever see those kinds of severe actions and reactions again, but we need to remember the lessons that were learned in that very short period of time of loss of markets. The George W. Bush administration, 2002, imposed tariffs on foreign steel, and in hopes of protecting domestic industry for steel and workers. And in the United States, what happened was there was a net job loss. We lost more jobs than we gained by protecting the steel industry, and there was retaliation. and there was U.S. agricultural export losses. So those tariffs didn't last very long either. So time after time after time, we see that for perhaps good intentions, good reasons, U.S. Presidential administrations decide to get tough, impose tariffs, and most of the time it ends up having an adverse impact on the United States. And just as a backdrop, just look at this slide if you need another piece of the puzzle. This shows exports of agricultural commodities to the rest of the world, U.S. agricultural exports, and it shows net farm income in the United States. The gold or yellow line you see goes back to nearly 1990 and shows that we have been in record-breaking territory in exports, as I mentioned before, in the last several years. The orange or red line shows what's happened with net farm income during that time, and it's pretty clear to see that there is some correlation, some correspondence between what we sell to the rest of the world and net farm income. And in a typical year, agricultural exports of U.S. goods and services accounts for about 35% of U.S. net farm income. Trade agreements, I haven't said a lot about, but as you know, one of the first things that President Trump did when he took office was to pull us out of the nearly completely negotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And that kind of left a vacuum there that China has begun to take over and will over time make it more difficult for us to develop markets with the Pacific Rim countries. And in 2017 and 2018, Trump has initiated a renegotiation of NAFTA, claiming that it was one of the worst trade agreements that we ever had. And I'll leave that judgment to someone else today. But there are some concerns that when the dust settles, that agriculture may be worse off than better off with these renegotiated agreements. So as we close, it's pretty clear that President Trump thrives on management by disruption. I mean, no judgment or disrespect there. It's a different management technique, and he thinks it works for him, and we'll see how it works for the country. Congress is not likely to reverse these tariffs, even though there's lots of people in Congress that are unhappy about them. There's no serious or current congressional challenges to trade agreement actions. So what Trump has done has largely been accepted by Congress at this point in time. Whether or not there's a change in Congress to Democrat governance after the midterm elections, we don't have any way of looking into our crystal balls and seeing what happens then. So there's short-run gains in hopes that importing countries and exporting countries will reduce their offenses as we move into a trade war situation. And the recent gains that we've seen in U.S. agricultural exports, I showed you we were in record-breaking territory, have largely come from the Pacific Rim. And that's the area that's most at risk as we move into this trade war situation. The World Trade Organization that replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade has a challenge avenue, and we will see challenges from many of these countries on what the United States has decided to do, and it will take years for those challenges to play out. I'll just close finally with What sometimes comes up in the conversation is not directly trade related, but some people say, well, we need to be worried about China because they own so much of our foreign debt, of our U.S. debt and foreign debt. And if you'll just look at the graph on the left, about a third of U.S. debt is owned by foreign entities. And out of that, on the right-hand side, if you pull that out and make its own pie, out of that foreign-owned U.S. debt, it's pretty much split, most of it, between China and Japan, and then other countries coming in behind that. So 20 to 30% of it, of that foreign-owned debt, is owned by China and Japan. It's probably not to China's benefit to divest itself from that debt in the short term. In the longer term, if they decide that's one of the ways they can punish us to make us back off, it could become a threat that we need to pay attention to, because that will have an impact on our economy. So I'll leave it at that. And if you have questions now, I'm happy to try to go back and answer them. If you don't have questions, feel free to call me, email me. If you make use of this slide set or any part of it, please give me some feedback. Let me know you're using it and what kind of response you're getting from people. And if you need me to come out and do some of that for you, I'm happy to consider getting scheduled to do that for some of your various audiences.
Thanks, Larry. Are there any questions out there for Larry?
Thank you.
I'm not seeing anything being typed into the text chat box. Larry, we greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning. A lot of great information. The slide set will be posted to the AggieCon extension website so that you can find it there. Still watching the text chat, nothing happening. So without further ado, we will be doing another one of these probably in the first part of May. If there's any need for a special session, I'll announce that as well. But as of right now, we will see you again in May of this year, second Tuesday. I thank you greatly for viewing our webinar and being a participant, and see you next time. Thank you.